Hello YouTube. A common argument against utilitarianism and some other consequentialist moral theories is that these theories are too demanding. They require too much of us. This is the demandingness objection, and this is what I'm going to talk about in this video. I assume you're all familiar with utilitarianism. There are many different versions of it, but the basic idea is that you ought to act in whatever way would produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Our aim should be to make everybody as happy as possible, where each person's happiness counts equally. Now, a good illustration of how demanding this theory can be is given in Peter Singer's drowning child thought experiment. So imagine that you've just bought some new shoes, and on your way back home you pass a pond in which a small child is drowning. You could enter the pond and save the child at no risk to your own life, but if you do so, you're going to ruin your nice new shoes. Should you do it? Should you run in and ruin your new shoes in order to save the drowning child? Now, most people, on considering this scenario, respond that, well, yeah, obviously you should save the child. It would be monstrous to just walk away. A child's life is much more important than a pair of shoes. Well, now modify the case a little. Suppose that you are considering whether to buy a new pair of shoes. Whatever money you spend on those shoes could instead be given to charity, which might, for instance, be used to buy mosquito nets for children in Africa, or it might be used to buy food for children dying of starvation. The money that you would spend on those shoes could instead be used to save a child's life. And of course, the same sort of calculation can go on for any money that you have. Any time you're about to buy a luxury for yourself, that money could instead be used to save a life. Now, as the utilitarian sees it, well, we ought to spend that money that would be used on luxuries, we ought to spend it to save a life. Proximity is morally irrelevant. So as a psychological matter, people are more emotionally moved by suffering that they encounter firsthand. But as far as utilitarianism is concerned, this doesn't make any moral difference. Any benefit or harm to one person must be counted equally as the same benefit or harm to another person, regardless of how that person is related to you. If somebody is starving, this is just as bad whether it's happening 2 feet in front of you or 2,000 miles away. And if you're able to help them, you have just as strong a duty to do so in each case. We shouldn't discriminate against people merely because of their location relative to us. Now, the vast majority of us who are living in relatively affluent countries will spend some of our spare money on luxuries for ourselves. So maybe you choose to buy a new television or a new car or new clothes, things you don't really need to survive. Indeed, you don't even need these things to be comfortable. If instead you donated that money to effective charities, you could save lives. So that's what utilitarianism requires you to do. You are required to donate a very large portion of your income to charities. By spending money on luxuries rather than donating it to charity, you are doing something seriously morally wrong. Your failure to donate that money that could save a life is morally comparable to the failure to enter the pond and save the drowning child. I mean, at least it seems like utilitarianism entails this, and as a matter of fact, many utilitarians do just straight up accept that it has this consequence. So, I mean, more generally, at any given time, whatever you're doing, if you're engaging in leisurely activities, maybe you're talking with friends or watching a movie or listening to music. Well, if you're doing anything like that, you could instead be doing something else that would have a more significant impact. You could be doing something to save a life. You could be working a bit more to earn a bit more money to go and use that money to save a life. So many utilitarians will hold that we are morally required to sacrifice to the point that if we were to sacrifice more, we would make ourselves worse off than those that we're helping. So foregoing luxuries like fashionable shoes or big televisions is the bare minimum that we should be doing. I mean, really, like if you really want to take this seriously, you should be foregoing comforts like air conditioning and hot water, and you should be sort of out sort of helping people or making money that you can use to help people rather than spending time with your friends. I mean, so from this point of view, the vast majority of our behavior is going to be morally problematic. So, utilitarianism requires that we make great sacrifices. We must sacrifice well-being, we must sacrifice personal projects. We're very rarely going to have any time off. This is the basis of the objection that utilitarianism is just too demanding, right? This is a problem. So the objection goes. There's a few different ways that we can put the demandingness objection. So one way to put the objection is to say something like this. We might think that any acceptable moral theory must allow people to pursue their own projects and to, acquire luxuries. It must allow people to live in ways other than just relentlessly pursuing what's morally good. So David Sobel, in Understanding the Demandingness Objection, puts it this way. He says, morality, except in very rare circumstances, leaves us plenty of free space to construct a life according to our own lights. The true morality, the objection insists, will reflect the truth that there are a wide range of permissible ways of life that provide the opportunity for people to fashion a life suited to themselves. And utilitarianism, utilitarianism is in flagrant violation of this. It requires you to basically give up all of your personal projects and devote your life almost entirely to helping others. Another way to frame the demandingness objection is to say this. Any acceptable moral theory must entail that most ordinary people, most of the time, live in a way that is morally permissible, at least in the actual world. So our actual ordinary behaviour is not generally morally wrong. I mean, of course, it would be very admirable to give away large sums of money to charity, but while that's admirable, it's not morally required. It's supererogatory. It goes beyond one's moral duty. Utilitarianism denies that any action is supererogatory, and utilitarianism judges that almost everybody's everyday choices are seriously wrong. So there's a couple of different ways to put the demandingness objection. Now, I do think it's worth noting that although the demandingness objection is most commonly raised against utilitarianism, there are going to be other moral views that could be targeted by it. So actually, in the article in which Peter Singer introduced the drowning child thought experiment, he doesn't defend utilitarianism there. He instead defends the somewhat more commonsensical principle, which is this. If it is within our power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. So this principle, this isn't utilitarianism. This requires us only to prevent the very bad. It doesn't require us to promote the good. It doesn't even require us to prevent things that are only mildly bad. And it requires us only to prevent the bad when this would not deprive us of anything morally significant. So, in order to save the child, right, like if that would mean risking your own life or whatever, then you're not required to save the child. So this principle is going to be a bit less demanding than utilitarianism, but it's still pretty damn demanding. It's still going to require us to do far more, to sacrifice far more of our resources to reduce suffering. Than we normally do, at least. So I'm going to focus on utilitarianism for the rest of the video, but it's worth keeping in mind that the demandingness objection applies elsewhere, potentially. Okay then, so what might we say in response to this? Well, there are many utilitarians who will just bite the bullet on this one and say, yep, utilitarianism is extremely demanding, and maybe that's counterintuitive, but that's just something we should accept. And I suppose, the motivation here is, well, like, why? Why not, right? Why should we suppose that it's a problem if a moral theory is really demanding? Like, why shouldn't a moral theory be demanding? Why is this even a prima facie objection? I mean, sure, it maybe is not comfortable for me if I'm going to be morally required to make these huge sacrifices, but why shouldn't I be? So William Shaw, in his book Taking Account of Utilitarianism, makes the point that our assessment of this problem may be dependent on our meta-ethical stance. So let's say that we're anti-realists. So we think that morality is something that we invent. Maybe morality is a sort of device for promoting social cooperation and for counteracting limited sympathies, for helping societies operate smoothly and peacefully. But morality is something, something invented, not discovered. Well, in that case, maybe it's plausible that, yeah, morality can't be too demanding. We can't plausibly ask too much of other people. We know that there are limits to the sorts of sacrifices that, most people are going to make, and we don't want people to sort of revolt against the moral norms that we lay down. Moral norms need to be the sorts of things that, yes, they impose limits on people's behaviour, but if those limits go too far, we know that people are going to rebel, and then we're even worse off. So the best that we can hope for is a sort of tool to motivate cooperative behaviour, and you're only going to want morality to be as demanding as is required to promote social cohesion. So if you're a sort of anti-realist who thinks that morality is invented for the purposes of just kind of helping societies get along smoothly, then from that point of view, it's going to seem like it would be a problem if it imposes these extremely high demands. I mean, with that said, I should note that even anti-realists might deny that there's actually any issue with demandingness. It's going to depend on how exactly morality is constructed, what exactly the point of morality is. So if we think that morality is constructed by reasoning from certain foundational principles, it might well turn out that those principles end up imposing unexpectedly high demands. What is entailed by the principles that we accept is not always obvious. But the point for now is just, maybe we can see from an anti-realist perspective why we might take demandingness to be a problem. For moral realists, though, the situation is less clear, right? I mean, why shouldn't morality impose very high demands? As the moral realist sees it, morality is something we discover. Morality is not up to us. The moral facts are what they are, and there's no particular reason to expect that they're going to conform to what is easy or comfortable for us. Our psychological dispositions might depart quite significantly from what morality requires. Indeed, we might argue that this is exactly what we should expect. After all, our psychological dispositions are a product of an evolutionary process that is blind to the moral facts. Our psychological dispositions are, they're shaped by a process that it rewards survival and reproduction. Sacrificing large amounts of one's resources to strangers, that certainly would not have promoted survival and reproduction in the past. So it's not at all surprising, given that that's where we come from, it's not at all surprising that the sacrifices required by utilitarianism are extremely difficult for us. But that is just, tangential to what the moral facts are. That's got nothing to do with what the moral facts are. So we might think, yeah, it's maybe it's actually not at all surprising that it might well just be that from our point of view, what morality requires is very demanding, and so the demandingness objection is really no objection at all. It's just a sort of surprising discovery, right? We can just look at it as, okay, well, yeah, it turns out that here's a kind of counterintuitive fact about morality. Well, here's a suggestion from so this is from Brad Hooker in his article on the demandingness objection. He says that the demandingness objection is essentially an application of the principle that a moral theory must cohere with our considered moral commitments. So he says, in order to be justified to us, a moral theory must cohere with the moral convictions we have after careful reflection. Basically, the idea is that a moral theory can't have consequences that are too counterintuitive. And this is a methodological principle that a lot of realists and anti-realists share. Now, intuitively, a person does not do anything morally wrong when they choose to buy fashionable new shoes rather than donate the money to charity. Intuitively, we think that most of us behave in ways that are morally permissible most of the time. A moral theory that entails that these ordinary behaviours are morally wrong is in flagrant violation of our moral intuitions, and so if you accept the sort of principle that Hooker has outlined here, that's going to give you a reason to reject the moral theory. So insofar as moral realists use their moral intuitions to assess moral theories, they may well face the demandingness objection as well. So, utilitarianism is quite clear that you should not give any money to me. You should not sign up to my Patreon and access bonus videos. You should not support this channel. That would not really do anything to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. You shouldn't use your money to pay for private tutoring that I offer and that you can set up on that email. I have a degree, master's, and PhD in philosophy, so that's my background there. Really, you shouldn't even be spending your time watching this video. You shouldn't be giving it a like or a comment. You should find better things to be doing with your time. But anyway, the links to all of this will be in the description, and as much as it's not really going to help promote the general welfare, I would really appreciate it if you could support the channel in any way at all. It's a lot of work, and the help that you guys give goes a long way. So let's get back to the demandingness objection. So one response to the demandingness objection is to deny that utilitarianism actually is as demanding as it first appears. So this line was taken by John Stuart Mill. Mill argued that actually the best way to promote the general happiness, the best way to reduce the general suffering, is by focusing on the lives of ourselves and the lives of those who are near and dear to us. Part of this is just because we are better placed to judge what is in the interests of the people we know, and part of it is because we're more easily able to influence them. There just isn't much that I can actually do for people overseas. I mean, and I guess, yeah, I can give to charity, but then lots of charities are just wasteful with their resources or are outright scams. There's no guarantee that the money is going to be used effectively. So, really, no, the best way to promote global well-being is to focus on local problems. So this kind of response, I mean, maybe this was plausible historically. I think today, most people find this quite implausible. We live in a globalized world. There are ways to directly give money to people who are struggling, even at great distances from you. And there are now many charitable organizations which, well, there's sort of large literature on effective altruism, which works out the best places to donate and the sorts of charitable organizations that are reasonably trustworthy. In any case, even if I suppose that there is little I can do for strangers overseas, there's plenty I can do for people suffering in my own country. I mean, I live in the UK. Now, in the UK, I mean, there's not really anybody literally starving, I guess, but there are still plenty of families who struggle to put enough food on the table. There are elderly people who can't afford heating in the winter, all of that sort of stuff. So any money I have would do far more good going to those people than it would, being used to buy new shoes. So, I mean, Mill might well have underestimated the demands of utilitarianism even in his own day. But yes, so that's the response to that. But there's a different way to defend the response that utilitarianism isn't so demanding, which is we might need to keep in mind that utilitarianism specifies an ideal, right? What utilitarianism says, it says, okay, the right action is whatever maximizes happiness for the greatest number. But that's the ideal, that's the best action. The best you can do is to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, there's going to be various other actions which will promote a great deal of happiness without maximizing it overall. And we wouldn't say that a person has done wrong in virtue of taking one of those actions, in virtue of failing to maximize. Indeed, if they take one of those actions, they've done a great deal of good, just not quite as much good as they could have done. So it's like, if I give food to 9 people, well, I've done a lot of good there. Now, okay, maybe I could have given food, if I worked just a little bit harder, I could have given the food to 10 people. Okay, so I didn't meet the ideal, but I still did a lot of good. And so, we're not sort of condemning people who fail to reach the ideal. The ideal is, well, it's an ideal. So, and in any case, just as a matter of psychological fact, people need time for themselves. If you were to try to spend every waking moment zealously pursuing the ending of suffering, you would burn out. and then that would make you less effective at achieving your goal. So any sensible utilitarian is going to recognize that there are limits to human motivation, right? To some extent, I need to help myself in order to be in a good position to help others. And yeah, maybe that means buying a few luxuries or relaxing with friends and family or, having a few personal projects on the go. Um, so, so maybe it's not quite as demanding as was suggested. Now, the issue here, though, of course, is, well, the vast majority of us live in a way that is very, very far from the ideal. I mean, it would be one thing to donate, say, 90% of your spare income to charity. So like, you use whatever income you have to buy necessities for yourself, right? Like the basic, like food and shelter. And then whatever spare income you have, let's say, okay, I'm going to donate 90% of that to charity. It's one thing to donate 90% rather than 100%. Right? It's one thing to spend 90% of your free time helping others rather than 100% of your free time helping others. I mean, if that was the way in which I lived, then I could reasonably say, hey, I'm acting in a way that prevents a great deal of suffering. Yeah, I'm not doing quite as much as I could be doing, but I'm still doing a lot. But my life is nothing like that. In practice, I do almost nothing to prevent suffering, and I think that's true for most of us. And since for utilitarianism, there's no relevant difference between doing and allowing, between killing and letting die. I am, like I am responsible for, well, yeah. I'm doing something very wrong here. I'm similar to the person who allows the child to drown in the pond. So utilitarianism, okay, it may not require us to meet its ideal, but it seems like, okay, we should be coming reasonably close, and that's something that very few of us achieve. If you're not coming anywhere close to the ideal, then yeah, it really looks like you're doing something bad. So yeah, you can cut it any way you like. It really does look like utilitarianism is going to entail that the majority of us are falling very far short of our moral obligations. Okay, so another response to the demandingness objection is to distinguish between wrongness and blameworthiness. Basically, an action can be wrong without being blameworthy. So let's say that Verity is an average, middle-class person with a comfortable income, and she donates 50% of her spare income to charity. So, after purchasing all the necessities required to live, she donates half of what remains to charity and then uses the other half on luxuries for herself. Now, Verity engages in a great deal of behavior that, from the utilitarian point of view, is morally wrong. But because she donates far more than the vast majority of people, we shouldn't blame her for this wrongdoing. Far from it, we should praise her for doing more than most, and we should encourage other people to be more like her. So the key point here is that praise and blame are reactive attitudes, and which attitudes are appropriate will, for the utilitarian, be a matter of which attitudes will promote well-being. It will be a matter of, which attitudes will tend to shape society in the direction that makes everybody better off. And it seems pretty plausible that it's not going to promote well-being if we start blaming people who are already doing far more than most others. If anything, that would just have the effect of turning people off morality. Now, if we are successful at promoting social change so that it becomes the norm to donate large sums of money to charity, well then, okay, maybe in that situation it would be it would be a good idea to blame people like Verity for not doing enough. But we're a very long way off that world. So right now, in our world, it's people like Verity that we want others to emulate. So whether praise or blame is appropriate it's a function not just of what is right or wrong, but also of various other factors. The general social circumstances, what is likely to lead to better behaviour from others. We have to consider how other people are behaving, and we have to consider what sorts of things would influence them to behave better. If you're doing more than the average person in terms of what you're sacrificing, then generally speaking, you should be praised for that. So in this respect, it seems like actually utilitarianism can accommodate more of our, ordinary moral judgments. So yeah, I mean, okay, yes, Verity is falling quite far short of her moral obligations, but she's so much better than the rest of us, she should be praised, not blamed. I mean, there are a couple of worries about this response. So, first of all, it seems like even if we just focus on the reactive attitudes, utilitarianism is still going to recommend that the majority of people be blamed for not doing more, right? Like utilitarians are still going to probably hold most people to be blameworthy, right? Like if you take the average person who donates very very little and is like they're using their money just to buy the new shoes or whatever, no, that is blameworthy. Second, and I suppose more importantly, it's not really clear that this actually addresses the demandingness objection at all. After all, what this response basically says is, it basically just grants that utilitarianism is indeed extremely demanding, and then it says, well, it's just that due to the potential costs of promoting an extremely demanding norm, well, in most contexts, we just shouldn't explicitly say this, right? Like we just shouldn't, like, yeah, utilitarianism is really demanding, but actually when it comes to our patterns of praise and blame, well, our patterns of praise and blame should be as if some other less demanding moral theory were true instead, because there's costs to promoting a demanding norm. But presumably what motivates the demandingness objection is the thought, not just that Verity isn't blameworthy when she buys herself the new shoes, it's that Verity isn't doing anything wrong. And that, when Verity donates these large sums to charity, she's doing something above and beyond her moral obligations. She's doing something that's good but not morally required. And the distinction between wrongness and blameworthiness just doesn't address this. So we might think that, no, this demandingness objection still stands. Okay, so let's turn to another response. So what we might say in response is, well, actually, utilitarianism is not really more demanding than common sense morality. There's a couple of ways to make this point. So, first of all, there are many circumstances in which ordinary morality, common sense morality, requires us to make significant sacrifices. So Brad Hooker, in his article on the demandingness objection, gives the example that, look, I can't kidnap a person and take their kidney, even if my own life depends on it, right? Even if I need a kidney to survive, I can't just kidnap someone and take theirs. So, if nobody's offering me their kidney, I am morally required to just sacrifice my own life. I'm morally required to let myself die. Common sense morality forbids me from harming others, even if refraining from such harm will come at a great cost to myself. So, whatever it is that makes demandingness a problem, the problem isn't simply that, well, utilitarianism requires us to make these costly sacrifices, because even common sense morality requires costly sacrifices sometimes. So in particular, there are social circumstances that can impose high demands. Many people are happy to accept that during wartime, I may be required to sacrifice in a lot and fight for my country. I may be required to give up my career, give up the creature comforts of home, risk my own life even, go out and face bullets and bombs in order to defend my country. And, what are the stakes here? Well, let's say that I'm living in a country that is threatened by invasion from an authoritarian state, right? The risk is, let's say it's a democratic country, and the risk is we're going to lose the democracy and become a sort of puppet state of a dictatorship. Something like this is the threat posed to Ukraine by the Russian invasion, right? And these are high stakes. They're high stakes. Given those sorts of high stakes, citizens of the country are morally required to make significant sacrifices. And in fact, the sacrifices demanded of citizens in this context are even greater than the sacrifices that utilitarianism ordinarily demands of us. Utilitarianism requires us to give away large sums of money, but in wartime, common sense morality may require us to give up our lives, may require me to, I'm going to have to go out and face bullets. So, it looks like we all, well, maybe not all of us, but many moral theories are going to agree that when the stakes are high enough, morality can become extremely demanding. The difference between common sense morality and utilitarianism lies in the fact that, as far as utilitarianism is concerned, the situation in the world is already such that the demands are very, very high. So like the current world is already extremely dire. Many people are literally starving, and millions of people starving to death, that's a more serious problem than, a country, than like a democratic government being replaced by a dictatorship. So yes, losing democratic rights is bad, it's very bad, but it's not nearly as bad as starving to death. So if the threat of invasion to a country can impose the demand, the moral demand that you risk your life, then the utilitarian might say, look, it's not unreasonable that the threat of starvation can impose the demand that you sacrifice lots of your wealth. Um, Now, of course, there are differences here, right? So the threat of invasion is that ordinarily, in common sense morality, that's only going to impose a demand on the citizens of the country in question, whereas maybe starvation is occurring to people in foreign countries. And you might sort of say, well, look, part of the reason for this is, the reason why I have an obligation to go and defend my country is because I live in this country. I've benefited from the various institutions that have been set up by this country, right? Like, because I've taken part in this country, that's what creates this obligation to defend it. And that's not going to be the case for the people in foreign countries who are starving. So that sort of argument, I mean, we can have that kind of argument, but the key point to see here is that if you're taking that sort of position, then you're already like denying utilitarianism. Utilitarians recognize no special obligation to one's country. Utilitarianism is completely impartial. Ultimately, all that matters to the utilitarian is aggregate well-being. So, there are plenty of objections that can be raised to that aspect of utilitarianism, but these are separate objections, right? I mean, if what we're objecting to is the fact that utilitarianism is completely impartial, then the objection is about impartiality. The objection is not ultimately about demandingness. The point for now is that, well, it's not clear that the demands, the sacrifices imposed by utilitarianism are actually greater than the demands, the sacrifices that are imposed by common sense morality. One way to put this is to say that utilitarianism is not intrinsically demanding. So if we lived in a world where everybody had access to the basic necessities, where there was no slavery, no war, no starvation, if resources were distributed a little more equitably, in that world, utilitarianism would not require great sacrifices from anyone, at least under normal circumstances. The reason why utilitarianism imposes such great demands on us is because there are really terrible things in the world. But I mean, this sort of feature of utilitarianism, the fact that like under extreme circumstances there are extremely great sacrifices required of us. That's a feature that utilitarianism shares with common sense morality. Like common sense morality also requires extreme sacrifices in extreme circumstances. It just doesn't take, ordinary circumstances to be extreme in the relevant way. It doesn't recognize the current circumstances extreme in the relevant way. But it wouldn't be, I suppose the thought is, it wouldn't be plausible for a moral theory to entail that we're never required to make great sacrifices. So maybe there isn't as much difference between utilitarianism and common sense morality as it seems. The difference is just in like what count as the relevant sort of circumstances where you have to make these great sacrifices. So David Sobel, in his article "The Impotence of the Demandingness Objection," presents another another way of kind of turning the demandingness objection on its head. So suppose that Ian is affluent and he's already donated some money to charity, but then he chooses to spend some money on a luxury for himself. He chooses to go to a fancy restaurant. Utilitarianism says that in doing this, rather than in spending the money to save a life, Ian is, he's doing something morally wrong. And the demandingness objection would be this is just imposing too high a demand on Ian, right? The demand that he spend his money on charity rather than use it to visit a fancy restaurant, that's imposing too high a demand. But now consider the situation from another point of view. Let's say that Barbara is starving to death and Ian could help Barbara. Barbara doesn't live near Ian, but he could easily transfer money to her and then, she could get some food and survive. Now, why exactly? So what we're saying is the demandingness objection is, well, it would impose too high a demand on Ian to say that he has to sacrifice his money to save Barbara's life. But then why shouldn't Barbara object? No, it imposes too high a demand on me, right? That I be allowed to die just so this guy can go to a fancy restaurant. But why shouldn't Barbara object that common sense morality imposes too high a demand on her? So the way Sobel puts this is, suppose she were to complain about the size of the cost that common sense morality permits to befall her. Suppose she were to say that such a moral theory, in permitting others to allow her to die when they could aid her, is excessively demanding on her. Why is utilitarianism too demanding on the person who would suffer significant costs if he was to aid others as utilitarianism requires? But common sense morality is not similarly too demanding on Barbara, the person who would suffer more significant costs if she were not aided as the alternative to utilitarianism permits. So, according to the demandingness objection, utilitarianism is too demanding on the relatively affluent people who it requires to make sacrifices. And it's true, utilitarianism imposes a pretty high demand on these people. But, okay, now take common sense morality. It doesn't require the affluent to make these sacrifices. Well, common sense morality seems to be imposing a demand on the people who are less well off because it permits others to allow them to die. Why isn't that unreasonably demanding? After all, the costs to Barbara of Ian's failure to give his money to her are far greater than the costs to Ian of giving the money. So the question is, why is it that we privilege the costs to the person that's being required to render the aid? Why think of demandingness only in those terms? So, utilitarianism is demanding on the affluent because it entails that morality is going to, take over their lives. That's all they can do. But then common sense morality is demanding on the needy because it allows famine to take over their lives. So, under utilitarianism, the affluent can't spend time on their own projects. But under common sense morality, the needy can't spend time on their own projects because they're scraping by just to survive. Or they're not surviving, right? So, it seems like the underlying assumption here is that the costs required by a moral theory are more significant, they're more morally significant than the costs permitted by a moral theory. So if I'm required to sacrifice money that I could use for luxuries, well, that's highly significant. On the other hand, if it's merely permitted that I lose money, or merely permitted that I'm unable to make money, or something like that, well, that's not particularly significant. That doesn't count as a demand that the moral theory is placing on me. I wonder, actually, if part of what's going on here is that we tend to think about morality from the point of view of the moral agent rather than the moral patient. So, the question that is always asked when we do moral theorizing is, what should I do? What moral theory should guide my actions? And when I consider thought experiments, like the trolley problem, well, the way that I usually imagine that is I imagine myself coming across this scenario and then I wonder whether to switch. I don't imagine myself as one of the people tied to the tracks, right? That's not the normal way that we think about things like the trolley problem. So, when we think about morality and when we engage in moral reasoning, we're always looking at it from the point of view of, the person asking, what should I do? How should I behave to others? And from this point of view, the sacrifices that a moral theory requires an agent to make are going to be more salient. But suppose instead we thought of things a little bit differently, right? So instead of thinking in terms of the demands a moral theory makes of us, right, what the moral theory requires us to do, let's just think in terms of the costs that the theory imposes on us, whether those costs come about through what we must do or through what is allowed to happen to us. From this point of view, it looks like common sense morality is going to be unreasonably demanding. Common sense morality will be more demanding than utilitarianism because it demands that the needy sacrifice their lives and starve to death. It looks like to get the demandingness objection off the ground, we're going to have to assume that there is some significant moral difference between these different types of costs. Now, the problem with this is that if we think that there's a significant moral difference between the costs that a moral theory requires and the costs that a moral theory permits, Well, it looks like that we just already reject utilitarianism for independent reasons, right? So basically, like, suppose, for instance, that we were to say that the cost of giving up one's life is more morally significant than the cost of just, dying where others, like just allow you to die, right? Like so if a moral theory requires me to sort of jump on a grenade or something, right? That's like more significant than, a moral theory which just like allows me to die of starvation. Well, if we're thinking in this kind of way, then we already reject utilitarianism. Because as far as utilitarianism is concerned, all benefits and harms are counted equally, regardless of how it is they come about. So Sobel says there isn't really any independent demandingness objection. Like ultimately, it's going to rest on other objections. I mean, so really, it's going to beg the question, right? Like in order to get the demandingness objection off the ground, you have to already accept some other objection against utilitarianism. Um, so. So yeah, I mean, I suppose at the very least, in order to press the demandingness objection, we're going to need to do sort of two things. We'd need to specify which type of costs count, right? Which count as demanding. We can't count all costs as equally demanding, otherwise we get the result that we're not going to get the result that utilitarianism in particular is demanding. And then of course we need to explain why, right? Why we're prioritizing these costs. Yeah, in any case, that's pretty much the end of that. I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to leave it there. So goodbye, everybody.